Thank you all for joining today. My name is Heather Deanne. I'm the chair of the Urban Forest Council and tree warden and city forester for the city of Hartford. Today's 31st annual conference on urban and community forestry and the 15th annual Forest Forum. We have a pretty great speaker lineup talking about forests and combating climate change, which will be here after we're done. The 2020 Forest Action Plan and where we're going in the next decade, which will also be here in this room. We're going to be discussing ash in Connecticut, which will be in the glass room, which is to the back of this room, through those doors. Deer pathogens and health will be held in here. And then for afternoon breakout sessions, we'll be discussing gypsy moth, and that'll be in the glass room out back. And wildlife diversity and forest management will be here in this room. I want to give a quick acknowledgement to our e-board. Drew, you want to stand up? He's in the back in the green. He's our vice chair. Emma Kravitz, who I don't believe is here today, she's our secretary, and we miss her. She actually left Connecticut Forest and Park Association to pursue a career in nursing. And Katie Beecham, our treasurer extraordinaire. Katie, where are you? She's still up there? Okay, so she's at the registration table. I also want to quickly acknowledge the group who put together this conference. Chris Donnelly, Katie Blake, Eris, who was chairing this, Rich Coles, Marilena, Bruce Bilwalk, Katie Beecham, Adam Boone, and Ron Pitts. So thank you guys for all of your help. About a month or two ago, we put together our tree planting in honor of Ed Richardson. I don't know if you all know who he is, but if you do, raise your hands. I'm just curious. Okay, so that's a good amount. Ed designated or gave his entire retirement to Connecticut's urban forest and education and outreach to the public, selflessly and humbly. And we recently planted a bur oak, his favorite tree, in Elizabeth Park in honor of him. The Elizabeth Park Conservancy donated a bench, which is now there, and there's a plaque honoring him. Our organization, Connecticut Urban Forest Council and Connecticut Forest and Park Association, is working together to put together a plaque to put on a stone at the tree, basically acknowledging that he is Connecticut's notable tree expert. So it's just really great to be involved with things like that and being able to acknowledge folks who really give it their all. And I'd like to just plant the seed that if we can all be like Ed, it'd be pretty incredible. So some additional points that I'll make. 10-second break, sure.
Technical change.
Are we good? Okay. Okay. So some quick additional points is the restrooms are in the back over there. If you can please silence your phones, that would be greatly appreciated. And if you haven't signed up for your CEUs, the tables over here to my left are where you can do so. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Eric Hammerling, who's the Executive Director of the Connecticut Forest and Park Association, up. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces from past conferences and also a number of new faces as well. So thanks to everyone for being here. As Heather mentioned, my name is Eric Hammerling, and I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Forest and Park Association. And you may have noticed that this year's conference has a slightly different name than we've had in the past. We've been referring to it as Connecticut's Forest Forum. And you might have wondered why we did that. We did that because of two things. First of all, whether you are interested in urban street trees or large acres of forest that are being managed, it's all part of Connecticut's Forest. So we wanted it to be Connecticut's Forest as part of the name, and we also wanted to make sure it was a forum. And if those of you who may know what a forum is, I'll give you the textbook definition. A forum is a place, meeting, or medium where ideas and views on a particular issue can be exchanged. And of course, every year we exchange lots of ideas on many topics related to our state's forests and forests in general. And of course, I think many of us in the room have a lot of similar feelings about different issues on forests, and there are many other opinions and viewpoints that we have in the room, and that's something that's a good thing. It's a really good thing. So we appreciate everyone coming together to talk about forests once again. Now, before I introduce Bill Moomaw, who is our keynote speaker today, I do want to say a little bit about Connecticut's climate change policy with regard to forests. And some of you may not know much about it, and I can tell you that you would not be alone in not knowing much about it, because there isn't much to know. Some of you may have seen some of the reports that came out, and the most recent one is from the Governor's Council on Climate Change, which came out in December of 2018. In that report, on the last page, the last paragraph, that is the first mention of land in the Governor's Council report. Now, we thought that was a little bit of an important omission because land is such an important piece of trying to address climate change, and of course, land is responding to climate change all the time. But if you'll just bear with me, let me read to you a bit from that last paragraph on that last page. Natural and working lands consist of forests, farms, rangelands, and wetlands that sequester carbon and support Connecticut's economy, communities, and ecosystems. Collectively, these lands provide us with an important carbon sink. Connecticut should work with the other New England states to measure and account for changes in land use practices to inform smart growth and protect valuable core forest land and prime farmland. Goes on with a few jargony things and then concludes, DEEP should work with land trusts, forest owners, and working lands managers to help adopt carbon accounting methodologies that further support sustainable land use practices. Now, although it is on the last page and it's the very last paragraph in the report, I would say that that is an opportunity for this community to get involved in climate change. And I think it's really important that experts in this room are a part of that ongoing conversation, not only because climate change is such an immense challenge to our world, but you have a lot of expertise that I hope will be considered as Connecticut charts its future on climate change. And as a former board member of CFPA always used to say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So I want to make sure that we are all represented at the table. Now, if we're going to be at the table and talking about climate change, I think it's important that we really inform ourselves about what is the science around climate change and how are forests connected to it, because when those questions come up, whether they're around a dinner table or in public policy circles, they'll be looking to all of us for answers. So it's with great pleasure that we're joined today by one of the nation's foremost climate scientists who's going to talk a bit about natural solutions to climate change. Now, Dr. Bill Moomaw is Emeritus Professor of International Environmental Policy and Founding Director of the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy at the Fletcher School at Tufts. He's a Nobel Peace Prize winner from his work as a lead author on now 5 reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And some of you know it as the IPCC. So today, Bill will talk, as I mentioned, about natural solutions to climate change and talk about a paper that came out earlier this year that he published with Ed Faison from Highstead, who I believe is in the room here, and Susan Messino on Proforestation. But before bringing Bill up here, I do also want to say on a personal note, this is a real pleasure for me personally, because Bill and his wife Margot have been very close friends of my family for over 30 years. And so it's really wonderful to see how our paths have diverged and connected over time. And so I'm personally gratified that you're here with us today, Bill. But just a quick note, you will all be welcome to ask questions after Bill's talk, time allowing. So I will get myself off the stage and ask Bill to come up and join us. So please welcome Bill Moomaw to talk about climate change.
Eric, I wasn't sure you were going to out our previous relationship, but since you have, it's been a wonderful relationship with the family over the years. Thank you very much for inviting me. And just by way of background, I'm actually a chemist. I have a PhD in chemistry. I practice what some of my friends call the dark arts of chemistry for about half my career. But very early on, I became interested in environmental issues. And actually, one of my first engagements in the environment was on forests. It was, we were living in California. I was doing my postdoctoral research there, and the Wilderness Act had just been passed. And a whole group wanted to cut a square mile out of the middle of the San Gorgonio Wilderness in Southern California for a ski area. And there was a hearing. So I naively typed up my testimony and went over and testified. And that sort of got me hooked on the whole idea that it's important for us as citizens, or as specialists, or as scientists, or whatever we are, to engage in the political process. It was never built. Right? I also served 10 years ago on the Forest Futures Visioning Project in Massachusetts, where what were we going to do with our state forests and what were our goals? And the goals in Massachusetts are that in 50 years we'll still have half the state covered with forest, and we have 60% now, so no less than 50% by then. And that was very interesting. I was the only scientist on the committee, but there were 3 foresters and then representatives of various environmental groups and others on citizens and so forth on that commission. And recommendations for the management was unanimously accepted without change. I've never served on a government commission where that's ever happened before. So those are just a little bit of background. So let's see. Well, I guess it does come on when I push the button. Good. There's a new term up here, which is which appeared in this paper that Ed Faison and Susan Messino and I published in June, Proforestation. I'll get to what that means in a moment. It's actually a new term for a concept of management that's been out there for a long time in bits and pieces. And what we did was basically pull it together with some additional research we've done ourselves and labeled it. And we know that the climate is affecting human health as it's changing. Obviously, in the natural world, tick-borne diseases, including Lyme disease, the name invented here in Connecticut, but the disease not originally in Connecticut, which climate change has exacerbated. It may be the first major disease associated with climate change. There's also, of course, Zika virus, West Nile virus, I mean, when I heard West Nile virus come to New York and Massachusetts, I said, wait a minute, this just doesn't connect for me mentally. Like, how does the West Nile get to New England? Well, if we weren't warming up, it wouldn't be here. Well, let me just start with someone with whom you're familiar, Gifford Pinchot's famous dictum. When he was asked to form the Forest Service by Teddy Roosevelt in 1905, he just said that he had this very utilitarian notion, because at that time it was cut and run. I mean, New England was just being, the forest in New England being slaughtered, and cutting down huge original hemlock forest just to strip the bark for tannin and just leave the rest there to rot. It was really pretty brutal. A lot of it had been cleared for agriculture, and the sheep craze, which mercifully ended in 1850. And so a lot of our forests date back to about 1850 when you look at it throughout New England. But his point here, the purpose of conservation, the greatest good to the greatest number of people for the longest time. Right? That comes right out of the philosopher Jerry Bentham, but he's just adapted it to forest. And it was appropriate to forests because forests are things that take a long time to develop. So the purpose of this meeting, you all know, but let me just quickly run through it. Here are the items that, it's all of these things. Oops, sorry, too quickly. And in fact, all of these, whether it's what's happening to the prospect for ash, that's my own question on there. What about, beech, maple, white pine, everything else that's suffering some kind of disease of one sort or another. Forest management considerations, and I want to really say around here, definitely this Connecticut Forest Action Plan. And each of these is underlain by a single factor that is important: climate change. It is affecting every one of those things that you're going to be talking about in one way or another. And it's already affecting them. It's not something in the far distant future. It is here and now. And then the second issue that is really a global issue is the rapid loss of biological diversity. This is animals, but it's also plants. It's also whole ecosystems. It is the things that support those, which we don't think about as charismatic species like lions and tigers and elephants and so on. It's fungi, it's bacteria, it's lichens, it's salamanders. The greatest loss is actually occurring in freshwater ecosystems, freshwater clams. Who's going to go out and lay down in front of the bulldozer to save clams? Nobody's going to do that. And yet they are extremely important to the ecological function of our street. And so what does the greatest good mean today? How does it include forests and forestry, but how does it include these other issues that we're facing? So these are just from the fourth National Climate Assessment came out just at Thanksgiving time last year. It's done every 5 years, mandated by Congress, 13 federal agencies, Forest Service, Environmental Protection Agency, every department has anything to do with the environment. Puts together this massive report. It comes out in 2 volumes. The second volume came out on the impacts, and it just talks about the heavy rainfalls we're getting, the heavy snowfalls we're getting. Even though the world is warming, if it's not below freezing, if it's above freezing, it's rain. If it's below freezing, it's snow. It's still a lot of film, of precipitation. And also, these alternate with drought periods. Remember, just a few years ago, we were all worried about the drought. I drove through one of those intense downpours for the first 45 minutes leaving Boston this morning, in the dark. It was really hard to see. I mean, it was dangerous driving. Everybody had, imagine that. Even Boston drivers were slowing down. It turns out that here, these are all from their electricity generation from power plants that rely on cooling. We've had to shut down in the United States nuclear power plants, coal power plants, because there's not enough water to cool them, or the temperature of the water was so warm it wouldn't cool adequately. This has already happened. It began happening in 1988. It's the first year it ever happened in the United States. It's been happening since. Hardly anybody talks about it. The great thing about solar panels, it doesn't matter. great thing about wind turbines, it doesn't matter what the temperature is. But with thermal power plants, it does. Infrastructure currently designed for historical climate is not adequate today. Cities all over are replacing culverts and everything else to handle weird water flows. And the tick diseases I already mentioned, that's a big problem. So more recently, we've seen this report that came out this past February, that 1 billion species on this earth are destined for extinction in this century, by the end of the century, is the way things are changing. Because of climate change, but because of the way in which we're transforming the environment as well. And there's been a 60% decline in global vertebrate populations in the world since 1970. That is numbers of birds, mammals, fish, amphibians, whatever it is. There is 60% fewer of those critters around today than there were in 1970. Just about a year ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in response to the meeting in Paris in 2015, said we're all going to get together and address climate change, and we don't want the temperature to rise more than 2 degrees Celsius, that's 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. You must understand the rest of the world doesn't understand Fahrenheit, even though Fahrenheit was a German who invented the scale. Celsius just means a scale of 0 to 100. 0 is freezing, 100 is boiling. Very simple system, we ought to adopt it, I think. But anyway, to keep temperatures from rising excessively, and they said, well, 2 degrees is the maximum we should go. We should try to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And here's the correct quote. To keep it from rising excessively, global net anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions must decline by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero by 2050. What does net mean? I've emphasized it. What it means is the difference between what we put in and what nature takes out. That's what we're looking at. That has to be down by that amount. Okay? And what that does is it gives us a twin opportunity for addressing climate change. We must reduce our emissions and simultaneously increase the capacity of nature and natural systems to take on more carbon dioxide than they do today. And that's going to be the gist of my talk. It's important. This paper came out from Susan Solomon and her researchers at MIT, and it's showing different peak amounts of concentration of carbon dioxide. On the left, can you reset that for me? Almost I hit the wrong button here. There are only 5 of them, and I meant to hit the wrong one. 20% chance and I did it. So you understand, even low probabilities have their consequences. Okay. On the left, these show, the scale goes from 1800 to the year 3000. That's not a scale we usually look at. But what's stunning about it is the following, that the concentrations of carbon dioxide, and which are here on the left, and the global average temperatures are pretty much determined by what peak concentrations we reach. So we're talking now about trying to stay, we're down here, we just crossed 400 parts per million, and we're hoping to stop at 450, and if we do that, it doesn't decrease for a couple of thousand years. The temperatures will stay for 1.5 degrees. We will make the 1.5 degrees, and will be that temperature for a couple of thousand years, unless we do something about removing some of the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So just not putting in more, we've got to do that, but that's not enough. That's the point. And this is why forests, obviously, are hugely important. Just very quickly, this is we can reduce it by making our homes more efficient. This is a zero net energy home that my wife and I moved into 13 years ago. We started building it 16 years ago, planning it, and everything is solar. Store solar heat in the ground in the winter, everything, and it uses very little energy. It uses less to heat, do hot water, lights, appliances, than the average house does just for lights and appliances. You could really build a house that efficient. We paid more because we were at the front edge. In this area, it costs maybe 2% more than code-built houses to build a house like this today. So it's possible, we just need to up our building codes and our ambition. Here's a house in the woods in western Massachusetts. So what we need to do is to remove atmospheric carbon dioxide and store it in the woods, in the wood of trees and in the soils of forests. This is the place we have the greatest opportunity. Wetlands are also a good source, but they store more carbon than almost any other place on Earth, but they store it relatively slowly. But they've been accumulating since the end of the last ice age 10,000 years ago. So that's where a lot of the soil, 30% of all the soil carbon is in wetlands. We've lost half the wetlands and in the process released the carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So as you're managing lands, protect the wetlands. They're hugely important. And the consequences of not doing so is irreversible. I mean, even if you restore a wetland, you're seldom able to restore its carbon absorbing capacity for decades to a century or more. So we're going to focus on forests. And it turns out that a whole bunch of studies have come out very recently which demonstrate that our forests could be absorbing much more carbon dioxide than they are. The way we've been managing them is to keep them relatively young. I mean, we're in a situation where most of our forests are secondary forests. And they've been managed in a way which keeps them relatively young when they are harvested. So we're going to talk about what we can possibly do to address that. And Beverly Long, who's a professor at Oregon State College of Forestry, has, every time we talk about it, they say, just remember, Bill, carbon in forests and soils is carbon not in the atmosphere. That's the key point that a lot of people miss. Absolutely right. So let's take a look at the climate science using a simple model that was developed at MIT to demonstrate how this works. So John Sturman and his students put this little demonstration model together. They actually do real analyses for real systems as well, but they need a little demonstration model. This is it. So let's look and see what is happening with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, this is showing the trajectory we're on. Back here in the year 2000, we were at about 7 billion tons of carbon, that is carbon dioxide going in the atmosphere. This is the world. Okay? If we continue on this trajectory, we'll be at something like 21 billion tons in 2100. Has a nice resonance to it, but it's not a good thing to happen. And what has happened will happen to the concentration in the atmosphere is it just will keep rising and will be up somewhere near 750 parts per million. So meaning 750 molecules of the atmosphere of carbon dioxide for every molecule of nitrogen and oxygen in the atmosphere. So it's just a percent. It's like a percentage, but it's per million rather than per 100. Okay, the goal is if we really want to stay below 1.5 degrees, we should not go above 450. Right now, we have crossed 400, and we are at about 410 right now. Back before industrialization, we were at 280. The world was at 280. So we have already put a lot in, and as you can see, it's going to stay around for a long time. So suppose the whole world would agree, we're not going to put any more in next year than we did this year. And we'll keep that up for the rest of the century. What would happen? That's called the flat path, right? Okay? And what do you think will happen? Well, it still goes up. Not as fast, but it still goes up. And when John Sturman asked his very smart MIT students why that was, because they predicted if you kept it level, the concentrations would become level. 80% of them. These are supposedly the smartest kids around, right? Well, here's the problem. In the flat path, the emissions still exceeded the capacity of natural systems to remove the carbon dioxide. Okay? So we're still overwhelming the system. So it takes some more out than it's taking it out, but it's not taking out enough. And so things keep rising. So what would it take? And suppose we really did this, and we had this dramatic reduction in our emissions, and we had done this starting in around 2005, then what would have happened is we would have come right in at 450 parts per million. But in fact, here's the analogy. That's because emissions equal removal rates. And the analogy is a bathtub. Think of carbon dioxide as water in a bathtub. It has a faucet at one end. It has a sink, a drain at the other end. The drain is open. The faucet is on. It's pouring in faster than the drain can take it out. We can either cut back on the faucet, or we can open the drain, or we can do both. And so what we're trying to do here is what's going to happen is when those are equal, it will stay at the right level. But what people have overlooked, including many scientists, is what is that level? We can stabilize it, but if we stabilize it and the average temperature is going to be 10 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than it is right now for the world, we're cooked. We're toast, literally. Literally. So basically, if you look and see how the oceans and the forests and wetlands are absorbing carbon over time, it looks like the red and blue there. And if we were to find a way for natural systems to sequester more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, this is what would happen. We would actually start to be reducing carbon dioxide, which means we could actually begin to avoid that eternal high temperature that we're headed for the rest of the millennium. So that's the key. So what you people work on, whether it's urban forest or a natural forest or a working forest, is the key. So this report came out on climate change in land from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. By the way, one correction there. The IPCC won the Nobel Prize. We who worked on it got a nice certificate saying thank you for working on the Nobel Prize project. But anyway, it was a privilege to do that. It really was. Thank you. And so this just came out in April, and it basically said, well, hold on. We're already, the air temperature of the world on average is already over 1.5 degrees Celsius. The land temperature, the average of the land and the oceans is about 1. But what we're actually feeling in the air is already at 1.5. So this is using the data that's in that report. It's actually not the figures from that report because they need a better artist for their diagrams. They're just terrible. But they get the data from this report, which is put out every year. And it looks complicated, and it is complicated, but this is how the global cycle works, and I'll help you along. So, emissions. So, oil, coal, and gas emissions, burning them, cement making, and so forth, put about 9.4 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide in the past decade, per year. And an additional 1.5 billion came in from land use change. This is deforestation. It's, what we're seeing, the fires in Indonesia and in Brazil, the Amazon. But it's also from deforestation and things going on in North America. I just learned recently that every year the world cuts, business cuts, 1 million acres of boreal forest in Canada that literally gets flushed down the toilet. That's just for making toilet paper. Stunning. Who knew? And when you do that, the boreal forests, most of the carbon is stored in the soils. As soon as the trees are gone, that gets released. So it's a double whammy, right? It is really bad. And the fact that the toilet paper goes to the sewage treatment plant, which probably doesn't recover the methane that's released in the sewage treatment, means it's even worse. So I don't know how bad it is. Nobody's done the full calculation. But anyway, the land use, this is just carbon dioxide here. It's a total of about 10.9. The amazing thing is that the increase in the atmosphere is only 4.7. We put 10.9 in, we only get 4.7 increasing. And the reason for that is because of the natural world. We have what the forests and other plants on land are doing, pulling it in, and we have the oceans pulling it in. So without that, we literally would be toast by now. So the question is, how do we talk about this? Well, they talk about it in terms of afforestation, planting trees where they are already growing, reforestation, land restoration, soil carbon sequestration, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. This is a scheme where The trees have already absorbed the carbon, so will burn to make electricity that will capture the carbon dioxide and bury it in a geological reservoir. It takes a huge amount of energy, and nobody has a system that works. And it actually was simply invented as an idea to fill the gap that appeared in the computer models. All right. So I'm not very keen on that, to be honest with you. And afforestation and reforestation are great, but they won't make a huge difference for about 75 years because little trees don't store much carbon. Right? We plant a tree now. This little tree, nice little tree, it does not have much carbon in it. And even if we're out in the sun, it will not be absorbing much carbon. There's just not enough photosynthetic factory on this tree and the leaves to do so. So we really need to think of something else. Well, here's the direct air capture. This is another idea. We're going to build these big machines and they'll suck up the air, and the 400 parts per million, this carbon dioxide will be taken out, and that will go and get buried somewhere. It produces no other useful purpose. There are a few of these in place, and Bill Gates is all keen on it and giving people hundreds of millions of dollars to work on it. And this one, so far, all of the ones put together are removing 4,000 tons. We're talking about the need to move billions of tons. So maybe someday will get it to work. I don't know. So let's talk about this idea of proforestation. And I'll first talk about it, and then I'll justify it, why it's worth thinking about. Proforestation is a form of forest management, and the term proforestation was invented by us when we realized that people were talking about this in many ways, but they didn't have a word for it. So as a result, they'd have a whole page of explanation, and nobody was getting it, because everybody was doing it a little bit differently. So it turned out we thought this would be a good idea to create a term, and it has been good. The paper's been viewed over 12,000 times, which stuns me. I've never had a paper viewed over 12,000, more than a few hundred times. So it's management that allows growing trees to reach their ecological potential for carbon storage in wood and soils. In other words, we're now thinking about another purpose for forests beyond timber and other forestry products. Gifford and Joe, actually, if you go back and read it, it was talking about timber primarily. But he also talked about water, the importance of forests for water, the greatest good for the greatest number. And I don't want to put words in his mouth because he's not around to defend himself, but I would at least like him to think about, isn't climate change and isn't protecting biodiversity also in the interest of the greatest number of people for the greatest good for the longest time? And if so, what do we do about it? And that's going to be the rest of this presentation. So it turns out that larger trees that are in their prime growth period, as you know, trees grow on some sort of a curve like this, and they grow really rapidly, and then at some point they level out. It turns out that's true for individual trees, but trees die, and new trees take their place. And if you look at a forest as a whole, what we're learning is that they continue to accumulate carbon even after they are supposedly mature forests. They do it in some of the wood, and they do it in the soils. Soils turn out to have huge amounts of carbon in them. Even the dead wood, the dead snags, the dead trees on the ground are storing carbon. And we now have ways to measure all that, which I'll show you in just a minute. So, how much are forests sequestering now? Well, something in the neighborhood of 29% of what we put in every year, and they're not simply a fixed stock. They actually are continuing to absorb. And forests and grasslands, this paper came out last year, could be storing twice as much as they are today. This is a study that just came out last year. And another study, if we allowed secondary forests, we're not going to do this, so don't panic. We're not going to allow all secondary forests to keep growing and not do anything with them, but just to give you a measure of potential. If all secondary forests in the world were allowed to continue growing, it would sequester 4.3 billion tons a year. The gap is 4.7. That's with the same amount of emissions we're doing. Suppose we did half of them, it would be 2 point something. Suppose we did a quarter of them, it would be 1. We have nothing that will remove 1 billion tons of carbon a year today. No system in place whatsoever. So the rate of carbon accumulation increases, a paper by Stevenson in 2014, and you go back and you find this stuff has been published in the past, but nobody's put it all together. And I'd say our contribution was we put it all together. And so Stevenson found that each year a single tree that is 100 centimeters diameter, that is a meter in diameter or something like this, of a species, adds the equivalent biomass of an entire 10 to 20 centimeter tree every year. Primary forests store more than twice as much carbon as do sustainably managed, rotationally managed forests. And that's been known since 1990. A study done in the Pacific Northwest by Mark Harmon and others, this is just showing the relative amount. More than twice as much as in the old growth forest as is in the managed with 60-year rotation. And the reason for that is actually pretty simple. The jag at the top is kind of the fluctuations of the carbon in the forest over time. This assumes it's relatively constant, and the spike at the left is what it is as the old growth forest. And then it's cut, and the amount of carbon in the forest, this is only looking at the trees, not even the soil, drops. Then it regrows, it's harvested, it regrows, it's harvested, it regrows. And in fact, what happens is that on average, the amount is down here rather than up here. So that's the difference. That's why it makes a difference. It's just the fact that there's just not big enough trees to store enough carbon, because we don't let them in that big. So then this paper came out, and this was really just staggering. It involved 48 forests around the world, including Harvard Forest. How nice to have one of our nearby forests actually included in this group of 48 forests that have been monitored for many, many years. That's what's kind of the criteria. So it's tropical forest, it's boreal forest, it's temperate forest, U.S., or I should say North America, includes Canada and Europe. The largest 1% of trees in mature and older forests comprised 50% of forest biomass worldwide. Out of every 100 trees in this kind of in these forests, one of them has half the biomass in the standing tree. I mean, that's just stunning. That's just stunning. I mean, a lot of people love big trees. I mean, they are magnificent and they do affect us in various ways, but the big ones, the really big ones, have all the carbon. And when you have lots of big trees, the forest floor is totally different. It's, it's got just layers and layers of deep carbon soils underneath it, whereas in other forests, it does not. So, and then the group up at the University of Vermont found that there are sites in New England that can store between 2.4 and 4.3 times the current amount of carbon. So one of the challenges I'm going to pose here is, where are those forests that we could manage that way, where the goal primarily would be to store carbon and recreate some of the ecological balance that we need. So again, working with people at Oregon State University, which is why this example is out there, because they did it, nobody in the East has done this study. We hear a lot about how wood, this wonderful wood floor, which has been here a long time, stores carbon, and it does. There's no question about it. But when they did a study of logging in Oregon only began 100 years ago, whereas in New England we started in 1620, I think. The first thing they did was go out and cut down trees. We've got to civilize this place. So they have really good records. So in the last 100 years, 65% of Oregon's harvested forest carbon has been returned to the atmosphere. The remainder, what is in long-lived products, like flooring and buildings and so forth, is roughly equally divided between those products and landfills. So basically, only something around 18% is in long-lived products. Turns out in the United States, do you know what the average lifetime of a house is? What is the average, if you look and average it over time, how many years an average house is a house? It's 50 years. There's a 2% annual turnover rate where we destroy houses and buildings. So 50 years. Where does that wood go? It's usually put in a landfill to rot, and that goes into the atmosphere. So, we think of it as long-term, we think of it as permanent, But it's not permanent. I mean, you know, we can go see Paul Revere's house, which was built in 1690 or something in Boston. That's the exception. They can last that long with a lot of care, but that's the exception. So let's just look in New England. So this is forest cover picture in New England, and this is the carbon density according to the U.S. Forest Service. And you'll notice there's some differences. Maine is, I don't know, what do you call that? Pink or purple. But look at this region right here, from western Connecticut, western Massachusetts, southern Vermont, New Hampshire. And there's another big blob over here of high carbon density, and that's, of course, the Adirondack Reserve, which has been protected in the Constitution forever wild since the 1890s. But this is the largest high density in the whole northeastern United States. In fact, you have to go all the way to Minnesota and Wisconsin to find anything like it. And then all the way from there to the west, to western Montana, to the west coast. And what are the differences? Well, the pink is 14 tons per acre, and the dark green is 47. More than 3 times the carbon density per acre, amount of carbon in the trees, in these forests, than in those forests. Why is that? It's management. The forests of Maine have been managed for the paper industry. You don't even need very big trees to big pulp. So they're all cut when they're very young. And there are very few big old trees or forested areas with large trees left in Maine. Baxter State Park. Governor Baxter bought it when it had just been completely clear-cut. So what we see today is from that time. What's grown back is from that time. Not very big trees still today. And that was in, what, the 1920s or 30s or something like that. So how we treat our forests, how we manage them makes a difference. Full disclosure, I chair the board of an organization called the Woods Hole Research Center, which was founded in 1986 by George Woodwell, who was one of the first scientists to really understand the implications of climate change for natural systems. He was an ecologist. He's also the person who figured out why DDT concentrate, bioconcentrates. Very smart guy. And he gave the first testimony to Congress in 1986 by a scientist on climate change. I'm at the stage in my life where I'm sorting through boxes and trying to get rid of stuff, papers and things. Well, I came across George's testimony. I'm not getting rid of it. It's 6 pages long. There's not a word in it that you would change today. He had it all right. What was going to happen to forests with climate change, how forests were going to address climate change, how they could be used to address climate change, it's all in there. He's got the whole feedback thing. As forests get damaged by climate change, they will become a source and a sink. It's all there. So this is Connecticut. And basically, the blue is urban areas, and the green and the yellow is the highest carbon density. And so you can see out here in the western part, there's a lot, and up here in the northeast part, there's a lot. And then they have this technique. What they're doing is they're using LiDAR. They're beaming laser beams that pass through leaves. So this is not just a picture of forest cover. It's of the actual amount of carbon or of tree that's underneath the canopy. And that includes dead trees as well as live trees, but you get the whole amount. So this shows what the changes have been between 2003 and 2015, 2015. And the red means those are losses, and the green means that those are gains. And the question is, how are we doing? Well, there's some gains in here, there's some loss, big loss right there, big losses here and here and here and so on. But the good news is that overall, if you look at Connecticut, you integrate it over the whole state, the gains, which were about 100,000 tons back here in 2003, are now up here to not quite 200,000. So there's been more forests have been growing. Furthermore, losses are bigger as you go down. So losses were much bigger back in 2003. Somebody did some really good stuff, and now it's been fairly level here since about 2008 or so. And this is the difference between the two. So the good news for Connecticut is, for the last 10 years or so, it's remained relatively constant and actually 2016 to 2018 data. It exists, it's in a computer somewhere. I hate it when things are on the computer and I can't get to them. But anyway, that's something we've all experienced. So this is the real situation. We now have a tool where we can determine exactly how well we're doing in terms of the carbon. Imagine having, as many of you I'm sure work in the field, imagine if to get these kind of data, how many people you'd have to go out in the field measuring trees and recording the data and so forth. Here we can get it in basically a snapshot, well, a series of snapshots. So we have tools now that we never had before. So there are still some old biodiverse forests in Connecticut. This is 2 different locations, the McLean Game Refuge in Granby and the Cornwall Pines in Connecticut. And this is just a picture again in one of the older forests in Connecticut. This is a dead tree. That tree will probably be there and still storing carbon for probably 50 to 100 years. I mean, there'll still be some of it there. And a lot of it goes into soil carbon, not into atmospheric carbon dioxide. So often we look at dead trees and say, isn't that a shame? What a waste, isn't it awful? But for the forest, that's how the forest regenerates. It regenerates on the death of its members who get struck by lightning or whatever it is. Now, if we look at age classes in Connecticut forests, what we see is most of the forests are here in this middle age group, 61 to maybe 100, 120 years. The rarest are the old ones, and the younger age classes, you hear a lot about. We have to have early successional areas for certain species. That's true. That's useful. I'll show you some exceptions to that in a moment. We have much more of that than we have of this. We can create this in a day. It takes us 100 years to create this. So what do we do with some of these trees that are here, which are at their most rapid carbon accumulating age for decades, to some cases species for centuries, for a century or more. So that's going to be the question that I'm going to pose at the end. And just to give you an indication of why this is important, this paper just came out earlier this month. Birds are an indicator, this is a direct quote from the paper, birds are an indicator of ecosystem integrity. North American bird populations have declined by 2.9 billion individuals since 1970. Here's the stunner. 1 billion of those species are forest species. This is the US and Canada, it's not just Connecticut. In other words, the ecological integrity of our forests is in declining. Otherwise, this wouldn't be happening. Climate change perhaps plays some role as well, but it is really disturbing. And so selective management has decreased the species richness of trees, animals, fungi, and bacteria. And current forest management practices are not maintaining ecological integrity sufficiently to keep these birds from disappearing. So we need more forests composed of older trees. And so this is just showing wildlife species richness, and it's slightly higher in older forests. It's this is true for this happens to be looking at hemlock, but it's true of most species. And what we see is that the number of species found in aged years going from 0 to 140 stays relatively constant and increases slightly, totally increases slightly as the trees get older. This is just showing that there's greater density and diversity of forest birds in wildlands than in managed lands. And this is work done here. There's just more species diversity when you have these wildlands than when you have them as managed lands. And there's one species, I know in Massachusetts we're doing a lot of this, we're clearing forest land to protect the red list vulnerable species, the New England cottontail. What's interesting is if you look at canopy cover, and you look at the percentage of sites occupied by the New England cottontail, the canopy cover, in sort of middle stage forests that have 41 to 60% or 61 to 80% of forest cover actually have the highest percentage of those sites have the New England cottontail in them. It's not the ones that are in the open land and the less coverage, and yet we're making this decision. And it's not just states, it's agencies. I mean, in Massachusetts Audubon is doing this. And yet these new data are coming out and showing that this is not the situation. Okay, this was just a summary from our table, and it just turns out in almost every case, forests have the greater value for all of these different measures are those that are allowed to grow. And so here again, this is just showing some of these older forests that are still here, and these are some of the species, the bird species we see in older forests. Now there's just one other thing I want to mention, which is the bioenergy. This has gotten to be a big deal in Massachusetts. We've had just a big brouhaha about trying to subsidize more of it and build a huge plant in Palmer outside Springfield, which would add to air pollution, and it adds to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It is not carbon neutral. It takes a long time for trees to grow. And even if you get to carbon neutrality is no good. We've got to be pulling things down. We cannot just keep emitting and saying, well, we're regrowing it, it'll be back in 100 years or 50 years or something like that. So this has been very contentious, but we're moving forward on it. I understand Kenneth has been discussing this as well. It is not a low-carbon, renewable energy. And this just shows one of the things which is really stunning to most people. If you burn wood, it emits more carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour of electricity than anything else, including coal. Okay? So that's at the stack. And then you have to replace the forest in order to offset that sometime in the future. And it's vastly more than even natural gas. And of course, it's infinitely more than solar panels and wind turbines and energy efficiency. I just want to show you this thing. We talk about the Amazon, and we're concerned about the Amazon, and this is showing tree canopy loss. And there is tree canopy loss there in Indonesia, but where is the greatest tree canopy loss in the world? It's right here in the United States. Shocking, shocking. And it's also up here in Maine and Nova Scotia, out here on the West Coast, and in British Columbia, North America. We are the leaders in terms of destroying these canopies, and that is all for biomass in the southeast. This is what the land looks like after they have cut the land, turned it into pellets, and shipped them to Europe, where they're burned and counted as zero carbon. Okay? And the statement by the company is, Drax, we never deforest. This is the plant. They're converting half of this largest coal plant in Europe. And let me just show you why this doesn't work, and I'll bring this to a close. Bob Leverett, who is a retired engineer whose hobby is measuring big trees. He uses laser rangefinders and all kinds of cool things. And he knows more about where all the old trees, big trees are than anybody. I teamed up with him because he knew where all this was, and we wanted to get some measurements. So in the Moomaw Trail State Forest, we found a number of stands of older white pine. Pine are easy, and hemlocks are easy to do because they're basically a big column, and you can measure them pretty accurately. Oak trees are really difficult because you know they're going to go in every direction. But let's talk about this. So it turns out on an acre of land, by age 50, an acre of white pine will store 22 tons of carbon. If you let it grow for another 50 years, it's not just having 44, it has 47 tons. If you let it grow for another 50 years, it's not 3 times 22, 66, it's 76 tons. To everyone's surprise, these trees are absorbing more as they get bigger, right? And this is the stand. This is not just the individual trees. This is the whole stand. And what's happening is, it's a combination. This is, the triangles are showing the growth of carbon in stands. This shows the number of trees. Sure enough, exactly what we know. Self-thinning, it happens, right? But the growth of the total remaining ones exceeds the losses you get from those. So these are the things that we need to think about in terms of bioenergy. So bioenergy, if we use it
At the end of 50, we burn that, put that into the atmosphere, 22 tons, and then we regrow it, and we're back to 22 tons. If we let it grow, we're at 46, 47 tons. This is getting us in the right direction. So I just wanted to leave you with that message. And so I think we just need to think about having two different categories of forests, those that we manage for production and those that we manage for other purposes. We've always thought about multiple use. You cannot do multiple use on the same piece of land. Right? Some are just not compatible with each other. And so this is where I appeal to all of you as foresters and forest managers. How do we find the forests that are going to be best for sequestering carbon, which are going to be the best for producing forestry products? And I think there's no way around getting and doing it separately. Our private lands, our public lands are great places to start. Those are lake areas that we actually have some control over. And in fact, it's kind of shocking that Connecticut has the lowest amount of protected land that's protected against cutting in all of the Northeast. So here's an opportunity. You're doing great in terms of the numbers, but you could do greater if you fix this problem. And for private landowners, let's think about some creative ways of helping them keep their lands in forest. And one of those is actually, if we paid them to keep it growing instead of paying them to cut it down, they would probably do that. This is being done in some other states and other places.
Repeat that one?
Pardon?
Say that one again?
If we paid private landowners, what would you have to pay a private landowner to keep their forest standing? In Massachusetts, 56% of private landowners don't want to have any forestry done on their land. That's their desire. So we don't have to pay them anything. But if we paid some of them something, they would keep it standing. They're doing this in California right now. And utilities are paying because they don't want to run off into their reservoirs for their hydropower and all these kinds of things. So it's something that could be done. So these are the challenges we have, but it's also the opportunities. And we really do need the input and help from you who manage forests and who, whether it's as a state official, or a local official, or as a trust, land trust, or working with the forestry industry. How can we get this right? Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That was a very insightful presentation. We're going to do a quick question and answer session simultaneously with taking a break in the effort to save some time, if that makes sense, okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I've read a couple papers lately that talk about the limitations to growth based on the availability of nutrients.
We've got a microphone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just raise your hand up high, please.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think it's, can you hear me? I don't think it's working. I don't think it's working.
Yeah, it's on.
There have been a couple of studies published recently.
Hold it up more, right there.
There have been a couple of studies published recently.
Oh, she's working on it.
There have been a couple of studies published recently that talk about the limits to forest growth based on ceilings of soil nutrients and changes in the atmosphere. And so while the charts project that kind of growth, have you looked at, or has someone been looking at how this is limited by the limited inputs?
Yeah, good question about the nutrient limitations. The two things happen. Actually, we're getting carbon dioxide fertilization, which is, and we're getting longer growing seasons, right?
Yep.
Those are both helping forests grow more. I mean, maybe we like to think it's our clever stewardship that's doing it all, but we're getting some help from nature here. But what we are seeing is that because particularly New England forests have been through so many cycles of cutting, that there's a depletion in some areas of nutrients in the soil. And so this is another problem with bioenergy. They take everything off the land. They don't leave any of the slash behind. None of that gets to decay, and the nutrients that are in the needles or the leaves or something don't go back into the soil. So that's another reason that I think bioenergy is not a good idea for the sake of the forest. But that is a problem, and they're doing studies like Covered Brook in New Hampshire on nutrient depletion. And so we're learning what it is and how to cope with it. And we may be into a situation like they are on the tree farms in the great Northwest where, I mean, they just fly over with airplanes and dump nitrogen fertilizer on just, tens of thousands of acres at one time. I don't particularly like that option.
Right. It seems self-defeating in a way.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, that's farming. I mean, and tree farms are a fine thing. And that's maybe what we're going to do. Maybe we're going to have more tree farms, more plantations that really produce the wood that we need for commercial products. Yes, back here.
There was an article recently in the New York Times by a trio of people from Massachusetts. I'm not sure if you were one of those.
Yes. No, I was not one of those.
Okay.
I know two of the three.
It was addressing the use of some innovative wood products for
Right.
building high-rise buildings and not using concrete, which has a high carbon footprint. But I'm wondering how that would play into the need to reduce cutting forests. And I wonder if you could address that.
Right. Well, we may not even need to reduce our total cutting. We're not cutting at the maximum capacity in New England or at all. We're very fortunate we're not at that state. If we set aside half of it for not cutting, there's still plenty in what's left to provide us with all the wood products we need. Now, what that article was doing, and that was David Foster, who's the head of Harvard Forest, and Frank Lowenstein, who's head of the New England Forestry Foundation. Sorry, I've been working internationally, I held that in my head. And a third person who was at Brandeis University. Anyway, Brian Donahue, that's right, at Brandeis. Actually, I've met him, so I guess I know all three of them. All right, but they're calling for something called cross-laminated timber, which is a kind of super plywood that can be used in construction. It's not exactly, they're doing it in Europe. The Forestry School at Oregon State is building a $40 million new building, and it's cross-laminated timber. And halfway through construction, some 100 of these units delaminated. Had serious problems with it. So it's not a 100% safe thing to do yet. The question is, whether you're the forestry industry or the fisheries industry, you're a business, and businesses all want to grow. But each of those has a resource that only grows at the rate that nature lets it grow. And you cannot outgrow what nature is producing unless you really intensify management in ways that we're talking about in some places with these high-tech operations. That's not the practice that we're doing here. So I think what we need to do is to figure, the other thing they did not take into account the short-lived time of those wood products, or the fact that the cement industry, not a bunch of dumb people, are actively working to reduce the carbon intensity of making concrete. And so, it basically was an appeal to, let's find ways to cut more trees to keep our industry growing. And so that was basically what was behind it, I think. Yes?
I was very interested in the slide you had of the carbon density in the Northeast.
Yes.
Describe superimposing landscape scale span replacing disturbances over that map. Examples would be the spruce budworm and the chestnut white.
You're talking about just looking at it historically? Going back and looking historically and things like...
Taking that map and overlaying...
Oh, that's an interesting idea.
Landscape scale span replacing disturbances.
We haven't done that yet, but that's an interesting idea, because we could then see some of the causes of the historical evolution of this. And some of them are human caused, and some of them are well, I wouldn't call the infestations we import from abroad natural. Those are also human caused. Yeah, thank you. In the back, in the back first. Yeah, you. Yes.
Yeah, that was a tough one for me to sit through. You're a very eloquent speaker, and that was a nice presentation, but a lot of this stuff I thought was a little confusing. The talk about the toilet paper on the boreal forest deforestation, the Crown land in Canada is a very highly regulated logging activity up there, is it not? And we all certainly need toilet paper. All of us in this room, all of us are consuming an 18-inch tree every year.
Yep.
Right? And the house, that beautiful house you built was wood. So society definitely needs wood. So this proforestation that is coming from the industry is a tough thing to swallow.
Okay.
That map you showed of the world and where all the trees are lost, is that not essentially a map of all the forested cover type in the world? And wouldn't that make sense, as that's where the trees are coming down, where there's trees growing?
Well, certainly that's true.
Yeah, that is true. And about the Pacific Northwest and the Oregon and their even age management, where a lot of that stuff is clear cuts, that chart that you showed, obviously you're going to have a loss of carbon in an even age forest management strategy. So I don't think the talk here is how or why, but how are we going to manage it? Not manage it. We need wood. America needs wood. The world needs wood. And back to, on hand here, the other map you showed of New England, where the carbon storage in the North Woods of Maine was very different than the carbon storage in Massachusetts and Connecticut. What if you overlaid a cover type map and look, and that was spruce fir forest up there. Down here it's all hardwood. Obviously the above ground biomass is much larger and is going to store more carbon. So it's not a map, all those pictures were really nice to look at, but I couldn't draw the common thread there. I couldn't see what you were getting at. But I think Gifford Pinchot might be rolling over in his grave if you were telling people not to actively manage their forest. And there's certainly ways to manage a forest in an uneven age management to preserve large trees and still fulfill society's demand for forest products. So a big part of me wants me to tell you to get back in your graves and take this hogwash back to Boston, but I figured I'd say these words instead.
I appreciate your comments, and I expected someone might say something like that. Let me just say something on the toilet paper. Look, why would you take 200-year-old trees and use them once for any purpose? What's the alternative?
200-year-old trees going into all toilet paper is hogwash, man.
It is not hogwash, I'm sorry, that's what's happening. And here's the alternative. There are alternatives. Annual crops have fiber that can be used to make disposable products. You don't have to use...
But they don't store carbon.
No, but that's the point. They don't use carbon, very much carbon either. The point is we can leave that carbon up there because as soon as you cut those boreal forests, there's a huge release of carbon from the soils. You don't get that when you're growing the crop annually. And there are products coming on the market that use that. I mean, think about it. Imagine if we could do it if we could make toilet paper out of Phragmites, wouldn't that be a great thing to do? Right? Those are things we need to think differently about this, is what I'm saying. And in terms of the other point, the data are very clear that the way we've been managing forests is not storing as much carbon as they could be storing. And the question we have before is, are we going to use this opportunity to find some forests? I'm not saying we don't cut any forests. And you're right, the structure of my house is wood, but the siding is not, because the siding doesn't last. The wood we're getting now for siding is very, quite frankly, not as good as it was 50 years ago. It rots very rapidly. I use wood for my trim. I've had to replace all of it in 13 years.
You got to get a new builder.
Well, we got to know it's not the builder. This is a common thing
I
now.
agree with you wholeheartedly. We need to figure out how to manage these forests, but a lot of your data was Oregon, Canada, over the world. Hardwood forests that we're working in can be managed to store carbon. And you providing the public with a little bit of information is a very dangerous thing, and you stirred up a lot of shit up in Massachusetts, and we don't need that down here in Connecticut.
Okay? We will keep our ship in Massachusetts. Thank you very much. Anyone else?
Because I'm passionate about this, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you.
Yeah, no, you also grew.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
I wondered if you could comment on what options, if any, there would be in forests that are in reserves. I'm speaking from the perspective of National Audubon, which wants to do forest management that would improve habitat for forest birds that are in rapid decline. And it sounds as if we're doing some things right in Connecticut right now.
Absolutely.
And a lot of our forests is going to continue to sequester carbon at a more rapid rate as our mature forests age. But in those mature forests, if they were to be reserved for some reason, I think we would still be advocating a certain degree of management, maybe to diversify the physical structure or to address invasives. Could you speak to the acceptability of that?
Sure. By the way, proforestation I view as a form of management. And in order to get forests to store more carbon, we may have to do, I think, we may have to do some active management to get them there. Invasives, huge problem. Where do we have the most invasives? It's in the lands we've cut the most. If the closer you come to a clear cut, the more invasive you get. That's just, there's a lot of data on that. So you want to avoid that. So proforestation is not about never touching the forest. It is not that at all. It is enhancing the capacity of the forest to store carbon and to regain the ecological integrity that an older, middle to older age forest would have. And that may mean taking certain things out. There are invasive things. We did things back in the 30s like plant these Norway spruce things in the middle of our state forests. Those are done poorly, by the way. And in Massachusetts, we're taking that out. Those are being taken out right now. And making room for the native species to take over and replace it. So there is certainly a role, and that's why I'm saying we need the insight and help of the foresters, even those who don't agree with this idea, to figure out how we're going to do this in an effective way. There are places where this has been in fact done, and we can learn from those as opposed to saying we're just going to keep doing things the way we are.
All right, last question, please.
Last question. Let's see. Sir.
Yeah. Wondering what your comment might be about the, if you look at the health of trees and the health of forests with climate change and how that's shifting and how that's going to affect your carbon storage.
Right. Well, good question. How is climate change and as we're going to be talking about here shortly, these diseases and so forth, going to affect things, right? I mean,
well, the diseases and insects will come later. I'm just talking about the health of the tree.
The health of the trees, right? Right. Well, you know, trees, they're like us. You know, they get sometimes they get sick and they get better, and sometimes they don't. And we do need to deal with those events as they occur. And it's also the case that that large area that we have here in western New England and southern Vermont, New Hampshire. That's an enormous asset. We got that largely by accident, right? When the abandonment of agricultural land and people discovering that in Ohio you didn't have to plow rocks, right? So they went to Ohio and plowed soil. They just had to cut down trees and plow soil. So that abandonment has given us an opportunity. We have a legacy here that we, in terms of carbon, in terms of biological diversity, in terms of timber resources that we would not have had if that had not occurred. This is one of the few places on Earth that has actually shown an increase in forest cover, right, in the last 100 years. So, I think we need to be intelligent about it. We need to understand what these things. We're going to hear about some of these various diseases and pests and health of forests and everything else later today. But I just think we need to have all of these factors on the table and make decisions about what we're going to do.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.